Well, basically in here we have presented new data. Actually, some of the abstracts that were presented here had not been presented before anywhere. More focusing on the targets that are considered important so far for gastrointestinal malignancies. I mean the HER family, especially the epidermal growth factor receptor, as well as angiogenesis and the different properties of angiogenesis. But perhaps the most important thing here is that we have been discussing a lot on other new targets that are being drugged at this time point, also being considered important for particular tumor types, or even more for subpopulations of tumors, because we are addressing more and more the differences of the different tumors in different patients for each tumor type. So we are microdissecting the tumors in different subtypes, and this is going to give us more opportunities to treat patients with either new targets, but also with new drugs, and also considering which are the targets and the drugs that are relevant for each tumor type. We had updates on new data, especially for some of the studies that were initially presented at ASCO, but in here, for example, in the bevacizumab TML data, we had analysis of different subsets of patients according to the biomarkers. So we had the data on whether this approach of continuing bevacizumab upon progression of the first-line treatment could also work in the KRAS wild type as well as in the KRAS mutant population, and this was the case. This was data that was presented here, so definitely making the point that for inhibiting angiogenesis, the KRAS status in the tumor is not really important. Also, we have some new data on the progression-free survival in this trial, especially in looking at the different patient characteristics, and also we didn't see any differences in the advantage of treating patients with bevacizumab in the second-line setting according to the clinical characteristics. And this was presented in two different presentations, two different abstracts, preferred papers. The correct study has evaluated the role of regorafenib in the latest stage metastatic disease. So this means patients that have failed all available treatments. And in this particular trial, it has been shown that regorafenib is active in this setting. So patients that receive regorafenib benefit in terms of progression-free survival and overall survival. And we had here data presented according to the different subtypes, and this was probably the most important data that was presented on angiogenesis. In the field of colorectal cancer, we had the first presentation on the data for the PETAC-8 study. The PETAC-8 study was an adjuvant study in patients with stage 3 colon cancer, and they were randomized to be treated with FOLFOX or with FOLFOX and cetuximab, initially for all comers, but when all the data of the KRAS mutation status become apparent, this trial was amended, and only patients with KRAS wild-type tumors were included from that time point. So globally, in looking at the data, the trial has to be considered negative. We in part expect the results because the American trial that had been presented 1 year ago was also negative with the same concept of adding cetuximab to standard chemotherapy in the adjuvant setting. But in here we had, as mentioned, the first data on the PETAC-8 study, negative but not decremental. The American study had a little bit decremental effect in patients that were receiving cetuximab. In the European study, cetuximab does not offer any additional benefit, but it's not decremental for overall survival and for disease-free survival. And I think that these were the main aspects on colorectal cancer. There was interesting data in other less frequent tumors like pancreatic cancer. We had an update of the data that was presented at the AACR meeting also this year on a very interesting compound, a new generation compound from a company called Threshold, and this is an angiogenesis disruptor compound, and basically this is the results of a randomized phase 2 study that suggested that the addition of this disruptive compound to conventional gemcitabine chemotherapy increase efficacy in progression-free survival and overall survival. Obviously, this data has to be confirmed in the context of a phase 3 study, but due to the mechanism of action of this compound, this data is really very interesting and definitely merits further evaluation in phase 3 studies. The most interesting data that was presented this year at the World GI, probably in looking at the population of patients that may benefit from the treatment, is the correct study data of the addition of Regorafenib. The reason for that is that in this setting, in this late refractory setting, these patients do not have other options. So definitely, if Regorafenib at the end gets approved, the full documentation has been reviewed by the regulatory authorities, both in the United States, in Europe, and in other countries. This is going to be a new treatment option for patients in the late stage, where, as mentioned, they don't have other options. All the other trials that I have been discussed before and I have mentioned, like the TML data, also the Velour study with aflibercept, actually what they tried to figure out is whether in the second line setting one option is better than the other. But we do have options in second line and even in the third line for the KRAS wild-type tumors. But in the later stage, this means third line for KRAS mutant tumors or fourth line for KRAS wild-type tumors. Actually, we don't have other options. And in here, Regorafenib is definitely a new option for these patients. Well, one of the inclusion criteria actually is that all patients should have exhausted all available treatment options. This means that all patients should have received oxaliplatin-based chemotherapy, irinotecan-based chemotherapy, bevacizumab at any time of the treatment. And for those patients that had KRAS wild-type tumors, they had to have either received cetuximab or panitumumab. So all available approved options had to be considered in this trial in the previous treatment for patients. The fact that the FDA has considered the approval of Regorafenib in the latest stage advanced colorectal cancer by a fast track actually makes things a little bit easier in the United States, where probably this drug is going to be available very rapidly. Unfortunately, this does not translate immediately to the same type of approval by the European authorities. They are much more conservative, so they are going to evaluate the full data sets. This means that probably it's going to take 1 year more in Europe to get the drug approved by the European authorities. Nevertheless, in the meantime, there is a plan, expanded access program for Regorafenib in this late stage metastatic colorectal cancer. So this means that patients may be able to receive this drug even if it's not approved because of this extended access program. One of the things that have been discussed during today is the way that we should develop new drugs in patients with gastrointestinal malignancies, focusing especially in colorectal cancer. So colorectal cancer is no longer a unique disease. It's very clear that there are different subtypes, and this is the same in the other tumor types. So we're investing in generating more and more platforms just to micro-dissect the different tumor subtypes that patients have, in order to do more rational-based trials, trials based on the biology of the disease, the mechanism of action of these drugs in the disease, but also the mechanisms of resistance, either primary and secondary. So we have been discussing also during these days the way that we should move forward with these rational-based drug development. And one of the things that we discussed 2 days ago was to establish a platform in the context of the European Union, sponsored by the EU or ATC. And this is what we call the Spectacolor platform. This is a platform that is going to be established in all countries, in which you will be able to molecularly profile any tumor from any patient with colorectal cancer in the countries of the European Union. And then with this information, the physician that is treating the patient is going to be able to treat him or her with the available options, or even to include this patient in a clinical trial more focused on a particular target or a particular pathway that is deregulated in the tumor that the patient has.